The moment I shut the door in her face, I felt the weight of a storm gathering beyond my suburban sanctuary. How far would one woman go to turn a harmless passion into a personal vendetta? The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the tree-lined streets of Maplewood Estates. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood where birds chirped from meticulously trimmed hedges, and children played on quiet sidewalks, their laughter breaking the serenity. This was a place that seemed perfect on the surface. Nestled away from the hustle and bustle of the city, every house was a polished gem, each manicured lawn an unspoken testament to its owner's pride. But beneath this veneer of tranquility lurked an unyielding pressure, one crafted by the iron grip of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. I, Jake Thompson, a passionate car enthusiast in my late 40s, had found my little slice of paradise amid the monotonous rows of houses. My garage, a sanctuary cluttered with tools, paint cans, and gleaming parts waiting to find their homes, was the heart of my world. Restoring classic cars had been a source of joy that connected me to my father, whose hands were often stained with grease, his laughter echoing in our shared memories as we worked together on old engines. Now, as I pursued that shared passion alone, each completed restoration filled me with purpose and a sense of personal fulfillment. My latest project, a vintage Mustang that had seen better days, was my pride and joy. I could almost hear my father's voice, offering encouragement with every brushstroke of chrome paint, every polish of the metal. Each time I stepped into the garage, I was transported back to those days, the memory mingling with the familiar scent of motor oil and wood. But in this seemingly perfect neighborhood, my love for classic cars made me an outsider, particularly in the eyes of one woman, Karen Lawson. Karen, a local powerhouse of the HOA, was a figure carved from the very stone of enforcement. In her early 50s, she had a commanding presence, her short-cropped hair meticulously styled in a bob and framed by oversized glasses that seemed to magnify her disapproving gaze. To her, rules were not mere guidelines. They were the law, and she reveled in the authority her position granted. Underneath the thin veil of her community protection lay an insatiable need for control that often felt stifling. She floated through the neighborhood like a storm cloud, ready to rain down her judgments on anyone who dared to stray from her rigid vision of perfection. As autumn began to crisp the edges of the leaves, an invisible thread of tension began to weave its way through Maplewood Estates. An underlying current stirred. Whispers circulated about my restoration project, which didn't seem to fit into the crisp and polished aesthetic Karen had so painstakingly cultivated. It was during one such afternoon, when the sun danced across the asphalt, that our paths collided. I was carefully applying the final coat of paint on the Mustang when Karen slinked into my driveway, her presence abrupt and unwelcome. "What do you think you're doing, Jake?" she demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, the fabric of her blouse stretching across her form as if bracing for an impending storm. I looked up, wiping my hands on a rag. "Just working on my car," I replied, attempting to keep my tone light despite the irritation bubbling inside me. She stepped closer, surveying the vehicle with a look that mixed disdain with barely concealed triumph. "You know the covenants. Those cars can turn the neighborhood into a used car lot. I need to inspect for any violations. You'll need to allow me access to your property." A quick pulse of anger thumped through my veins. "Karen, this is my personal property. I'm not comfortable with that." Her expression soured further, and I could see the gears of retribution starting to turn in her mind. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, the tension crackling as I held my ground. I refused to let her invade my space, yet her presence felt heavy, an unyielding weight of authority pressing down on my shoulders. She didn't like being denied, and in that moment, I understood the implications of my refusal. It was not just a fleeting exchange. I had unwittingly ignited a conflict that would soon morph into an all-out battle. The echoes of my father's long-ago warnings about standing one's ground buzzed in my mind. The belief that what you love must sometimes be protected at all costs. Karen stomped her foot like a child denied a candy bar, her annoyance simmering just beneath the surface. "You'll regret this, Jake," she spat before pivoting dramatically. The air shifted, and I could feel the storm she was brewing. Yet there I stood, defiant and determined, reinforced by the spirit of that young boy who learned to wield a wrench alongside his father. In the quiet solitude of my garage, I steeled myself for the fight against what felt like an untamed beast. My classic car restoration as the foal trapped in a relentless storm's path. Thus, the stage was set. The battle lines had been drawn. Little did I know then that this would spark a war that would shake the very foundations of our sleepy community. The sun dipped low in the evening sky, casting long shadows that stretched along the neatly trimmed lawns of Elmwood Estates, the picturesque suburban neighborhood I had called home for the past decade. Each house was a replica of the last, their exteriors draped in varying shades of beige, with manicured hedges and perfectly aligned garden gnomes ready to greet anyone who dared wander down our streets. It was the kind of neighborhood that thrived on conformity, a utopia in the eyes of the overly vigilant Homeowners Association, HOA. Yet beneath this glossy veneer of serenity lay an undercurrent of tension, an oppressive blanket that stifled individuality like a heavy fog. I stood in my driveway, a sacred space cast in the warm glow of the golden hour, kneeling beside my pride and joy. A classic 1969 Mustang, its burgundy paint gleaming despite the dullness of the surroundings. I felt a thrill of joy race through me as I wiped my hands on a rag and stood to admire my labor of love. Cars had always been my escape, my canvas. Each bolt I tightened, every scratch I sanded down, brought a sense of renewal. Unfortunately for me, this little hobby had recently become the target of a rather relentless foe. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of our neighborhood's unwritten laws. As I leaned closer to inspect a bit of rust on the fender, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel disturbed my reverie. I looked up to find Karen striding toward me, her brow furrowed and her hands tightly clasped in front of her. Dressed like a schoolmarm from an old movie, she wore a blazer that struck me as a cross between business formal and over-the-top respectable. Karen had a reputation for loving rules more than life itself. The mere sight of her set off alarm bells in the minds of the neighborhood's inhabitants. I had seen her on countless occasions, scuttling around with her clipboard, ensuring that our community adhered to every last regulation imposed by the HOA. "Good evening," I said evenly, trying to maintain my peace. "Good evening? Is that what you call this?" Karen's voice, sharp as a razor, cut through the warmth in the air. "You're violating HOA guidelines with this mess." She gestured disdainfully toward my Mustang, as if it were a rancid piece of garbage. "You know it's against the regulations to have a vehicle in this condition sitting in your driveway, don't you?" I took a breath, holding back the irritation that simmered beneath the surface. I'm in the middle of restoration. Once it's done, it'll be spectacular. Karen narrowed her eyes, her mouth set in a thin line. "Restoration or not, this isn't the image our neighborhood wants to project. You need to let me inspect your property for further violations." I felt my heart race. Inspect my property? No, I'm not comfortable with that. "Without proper oversight, this community is at risk," she exclaimed, hands flying in the air as if she were conducting an orchestra of chaos. "You should be grateful I care enough to warn you." Her refusal to consider my side of the story ignited my resolve. "Karen, I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood, but there's no need for an inspection. I'm fully within my rights to work on my car here." "Our rights?" she sneered, leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Right now, it's your word against the community's standards. I'd advise you to reconsider. Perhaps I could enlist the support of your neighbors?" My mind raced as I viewed the situation with growing alarm. The subtle threat hung between us, laden with unspoken consequences. I glanced past her to the neighbors' houses, imagining them peeking through their curtains, ready to join forces with her crusade. I couldn't let this go unchecked. I would not allow my passion to be squashed by her zealous grip on authority. I think our neighbors have more pressing concerns than your interpretations of the HOA rules. I shot back, trying to keep my tone even. What I see is a community ready to take action, she declared, a smirk breaking across her face, as if she had just dropped the curtain on a grand performance. You'll soon realize this isn't just about you. Standards must be upheld, and I am the guardian of our neighborhood's integrity. As she turned on her heel and marched away, I felt my stomach sink. Frustration boiled within me. I struggled with the suffocating knowledge that this seemingly benign neighborhood could devolve into a battleground at any moment. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was wielding them like a weapon. I turned back to my Mustang, a mix of anxiety and determination swelling inside me. This was about more than a car. It was about standing firm against an unwarranted force, protecting what mattered to me, and showing that I wouldn't be intimidated by anyone, even if they were hiding behind a facade of authority and community service. I clenched my fists, my grandmother's words ringing clear in my mind. Stand your ground, respect your passions, and know that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the yard of one's spirit. As dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, I couldn't shake the mounting sense of challenge. The stakes had just been raised, but Karen would soon learn that the spirit of individuality within this mundane suburb wouldn't be silenced so easily. The calm facade of Elmwood Estates was about to unravel, and I would be at the center of it all. As I stood in my cluttered garage, the comforting scent of motor oil mixed with sawdust hung in the air like a familiar embrace. Surrounding me were the skeletal remains of a '69 Mustang, the very object of my passion, where bits of metal awaited careful restoration. Yet my focus was shattered by the distant echo of a barking dog, a sign that my demented neighbor had resumed her campaign against me. Karen. It had only been a few days since I declined her insistent request to enter my sanctuary for a mandatory inspection, her words oozing with an authority she believed she possessed as an HOA member. Now, it felt like the whole neighborhood was entangled in her twisted vendetta, as if she had transformed into a modern-day witch, rallying the townsfolk with whispers of dissension. The thought twisted my stomach. "Can you believe her?" my voice muttered, echoing in the garage like a long-held frustration begging for release. My grandmother's words whirled in my mind. "Stand firm in your truth, honey, even when the world tries to knock you down." And for the first time since this mess began, I felt a swell of despair mixed with determination rise within me. When the sun dipped low in the sky that evening, illuminating the quiet cul-de-sac with an orange glow, I sensed the tension thickening in the air, like a storm about to break. It wasn't just me preparing to face the ire of the neighborhood. It felt like the beginning of a siege. I then noticed an unfamiliar sight through the garage window. Karen standing at the end of the street, her hands on her hips like a peacock ready to strut her authority. A cluster of neighbors had gathered around her like moths drawn to a flame, nodding earnestly in agreement as she gestured vehemently toward my garage. My heart rate quickened. What right did she have to launch a direct assault on my passion? I thought that living here meant being part of a community that valued personal expression, not one stifled by someone's narrow-minded view of beautification. It wasn't as if I was running a junkyard. I was crafting art, 1 inch of rust at a time. Stepping outside, I took a deep breath, letting the cool air waft over me. The conversation between neighbors buzzed softly, but as I ventured closer, I began picking out distinct phrases. Safety hazard. Disrupting neighborhood harmony. I gritted my teeth. My car didn't even have its engine in yet, let alone any parts that could pose a threat. I felt myself boiling over as the coldness of Karen's campaign seeped into the collective conscience around me. "Hey, Ray," shouted one of the neighbors, a middle-aged man I'd often shared a friendly wave with, but never a full conversation. "What's going on with that car? We heard you're making a mess of the driveway." Mess of the driveway? What an absurd accusation. I felt a sudden rush of indignation. I'm restoring a classic car, Jim. It's not a mess. It's a work in progress. Hey man, we're just concerned. You know how Karen is? She seems to think it's a problem. His voice trailed off, eyes scanning for Karen's watchful gaze. I realized in that moment how Karen had turned my beloved craft into a community issue. I needed to find the right words to express the passion behind my project. The very essence of my creativity and life was under fire. It was no longer just my garage in jeopardy. It was my reputation, and worse yet, my right as a homeowner. Ignoring the knot in my stomach, I marched straight toward the main gathering with a resolve that could rival a soldier heading into battle. "Listen up, everyone," I shouted, cutting through the murmurs like a hot knife through butter. I care deeply about this community, and I'm a firm believer that we should support each other, not tear each other down over misguided notions. Karen smirked, leaning into her power. Support? You mean continue to tolerate your personal eyesore? Ask yourself, is that really what our neighborhood stands for? A ripple of laughter surfaced from the group around her. I felt blood rush to my face. Those laughs were like daggers. How dare she manipulate this community's values for her own agenda? What I create in my garage impacts this neighborhood in a positive way. Just because it doesn't look like a cookie-cutter house doesn't mean it's an eyesore. How many of you have hobbies you're proud of? Why should I be ashamed of mine? She scoffed, rolling her eyes. This is about more than just you. It's about setting standards. We have rules for a reason. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. But those rules shouldn't stifle creativity or individuality. I'm not breaking any laws here. Is expressing yourself really so threatening? Surrounded by the curious stares of neighbors, I could read their doubt, but also flickers of support igniting behind their eyes. I glanced back at the garage where my project sat, suspended in time, an unfinished testament to the joy it brought me. Meanwhile, Karen's disruption grew bolder. He's just trying to make excuses for his clutter. What if it attracts dangerous pests? What if it's a fire hazard? I shook my head in disbelief. And what about the noise from your dog? What about your new flamingo lawn ornaments? Can we really talk about aesthetics? Laughter erupted from a few sympathetic neighbors, but Karen's glare hardened. You may want to listen when I bring this up at the next HOA meeting, she boomed back, scowling. Special interests shouldn't supersede community values, and if you think you're above the rules, I'll see that you pay for it. Inside, I felt crushed and invigorated simultaneously. The emotional roller coaster of the past few days weighed heavily as I stared her down, each accusation flinging against my sense of justice, igniting the fire of my defiance. Bring it on, Karen, I whispered to myself, igniting both trepidation and courage within. If standing my ground meant savoring the very essence of who I was, an unapologetic car enthusiast raising a classic from the ashes, then I would rise up, no matter how daunting this battle felt. And I knew one thing. The upcoming HOA meeting would be a reckoning. I would fight for my right to restore my car and, in turn, reclaim my integrity and place in this community. I felt my grandmother's spirit beside me, and as fear sidled with determination, the clash of my values with Karen's would soon reveal itself in this grand showdown of sorts. I had always enjoyed the soft hum of the neighborhood on a warm summer evening as it wrapped around me like a comfortable shawl. But tonight, that tranquility felt distant, replaced by an unsettling tension that gnawed at my insides. The swirling storm of conflict with Karen had steadily intensified, leading to an impending showdown I was not sure I was ready for. As the sun dipped in a fiery orange hue beyond the horizon, I sat in my garage, the remnants of my classic car stripped down in stages. My fingers were stained with grease, the scent of motor oil thick in the air, a stark contrast to the perfumed lawns outside. Restoring this car wasn't just a hobby. It was an expression of my identity, a connection to simpler times. But Karen's insistent campaign against me had turned this sanctuary into a battleground. and I could no longer ignore her growing influence over the neighborhood. With a pounding heart and a head swarming with anxiety, I pored over my notes for the HOA meeting, a crucial moment that would dictate not just the fate of my project, but also my standing in the community. I could already envision Karen's smug face, the way her eyes narrowed as she unfurled her accusations against me, each word dripping with scorn for my passion. "Look at him," she'd likely say, her voice dripping with condescension. "He's turning our neighborhood into a junkyard. What's next? A racetrack?" I released a shaky breath, reminding myself of my grandmother's words echoing in my mind. "Stand tall like the oak tree, son. They'll try to uproot you, but nothing cracks that sturdy trunk." The wisdom she bestowed upon me helped sharpen my resolve, yet doubts lingered at the corners of my thoughts, prompting questions that circled relentlessly. Was I truly ready to stand alone against her? The night before the meeting, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and felt a shiver run down my spine. It was a neighbor, Doug, who used to wave at me from his porch but had recently sided with Karen. I hesitated but answered, curiosity and fear coiling together in my stomach. "Hey, Mark," he said, his tone casual yet suffused with an undercurrent of tension. "So, I hear there's some trouble brewing with Karen. I wanted to see how you're doing." "Just preparing for the meeting," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady despite my rising apprehension. "Listen, maybe you should consider laying low. Karen's got some serious clout with the board, and she's been organizing the neighborhood. They're on her side, man. You might want to be careful." My gut twisted at his warning, yet I found the nerve to respond. "It's unfair, Doug. This was something I loved. My car isn't a problem, it's just a project." There was a pause on the line, and I could sense the internal struggle through the silence. "I get it, Mark, but sometimes you just want to keep the peace." "How about what makes me happy?" I snapped, my patience fraying. "Isn't that important too?" There was no response, just the sound of an uncomfortable cough. "I've got to go," I said finally, feeling the weight of his unspoken judgment. Hitting end on the call felt like severing the last tenuous connection to camaraderie in our neighborhood. The next afternoon, nerves crackled in the air as I stepped into the HOA meeting. The dimly lit community center was filled with faces, some familiar, some cold with stony indifference. Karen sat at the front, exuding an aura of superiority as she flipped through her meticulously prepared binder, her crown of tightly coiled hair framing a scowl that could curdle milk. I took my seat, absorbing the weight of gazes directed my way, most of which held a flash of hostility or at the very least ambivalence. "Welcome, neighbors," she called with a cheerful demeanor that struck me as contrived. "Today, we bring forth some community issues that need addressing. Namely, Mr. Mark Wilson's glaring violations regarding his car restoration project." At the mention of my name, whispers rippled through the room, fingers pointed like arrows aimed at my pride. My palms felt sweaty on the chair's armrest, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. I couldn't allow my fear to rule my actions. I had to speak. As Karen laid out her grievances, safety hazards, unsightly mess, and disturbances to the peaceful living conditions, I could hear her voice transform into a distant echo. It felt surreal, like a scene straight from my worst nightmares where I stood condemned for simply having a passion. My stomach churned as Karen painted my passion as toxic waste. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood, trembling but driven by a spark of defiance. "Thank you for your concerns, Karen." I glanced around the room, seeing some expressions soften, but mostly hardened looks filled with preconceptions. "But my restoration project isn't an eyesore or a hazard. It's a piece of art and history. I work diligently not just to preserve this car, but to cherish my late father's legacy." The room fell silent. I steadied my breath, seeking the right words. "You all know me. I've contributed to this community, from volunteering for the summer BBQs to helping neighbors with their own projects. This isn't just about a car. It's about who we are as neighbors, as friends. Do we want to condemn each other for simply pursuing our passions? Karen's glare was like ice in a furnace, cold, but unyielding. This isn't about personal feelings, Mark. It's about maintaining community standards. But at what cost? I challenged, emotion boiling over. In pursuit of conformity, are we sacrificing our individuality, our joys? This neighborhood is supposed to celebrate diversity, not choke it on the vine. The tension in the room thickened. For a heartbeat, I felt the atmosphere shift, a brief stirring of solidarity. But Karen was relentless, leaning forward with a smirk. You think waving around your father's memory is going to shield you from the truth? This isn't your family's land. It's a shared community. Then why don't we love and support one another instead of tearing each other down? I fired back, every word punctuated with my passion. The back and forth interplay of voices reached fever pitch, but just as I thought I had broken through, confusion mixed with despair flooded back in. Outside noise faded away, leaving only the conflict within me resonating. I could feel the stakes rising. My passion was steeped in anger, and if I didn't control it, I would lose everything. As the board began to deliberate, a heavy tension gripped me, shadows from the past merging with my present. What awaited me? Would the board recognize the validity of my voice? Or would I be relinquished to the sidelines under Karen's unyielding reign? The agony of uncertainty clenched my gut, and I stared at Derek, one of the board members, desperately hoping he would see through the chaos and offer a glimmer of hope. And just like that, the meeting ground to a halt, silence enveloping the room, swirling questions lingering palpably in the air. What would they decide? My heart raced. The fate of my passion dangled precariously on the edge. The HOA meeting hall was an unremarkable venue. A square room with off-white walls and chairs arranged in a stark row like a courtroom where the innocent awaited their fate. Yet, as I stood at the head of the well-worn wooden table, my heart pounded, and the dullness of the surroundings faded, leaving only the weight of this moment hanging heavy in the air. To my left, Karen sat with her arms crossed, a smugness plastered across her face, enjoying the anticipation of pinning me down like a bull in a ring. She believed she had already won, the smell of victory wafting around her like cheap perfume. The meeting had attracted a modest crowd of neighbors, their curious faces shadowed by the tension in the room. I swept my gaze across the familiar faces, some barely concealing their disdain for me, while others wore expressions of concern. Had I become the villain in a story I never wanted to be a part of? Perhaps I had underestimated the power of one well-connected woman. I inhaled deeply, gathering strength from the advice my grandmother had imparted during my many sleepless nights. Remember, dear, it's not just about the fight. It's about standing tall for what you love. Taking a step forward, I slid a stack of papers onto the surface before me, the sound of them rustling acting as a catalyst for my nerves. Thank you all for gathering here tonight. I appreciate your willingness to listen, I began, fighting to keep my voice steady against the rising tide of anxiety. As many of you know, I have been restoring a classic car in my garage. It's not just a hobby. It's a passion that brings me joy, one that connects me to my father and the cherished memories of our time in the garage together. I paused, letting the words resonate, feeling the ghost of my father beside me, urging me on. Karen rolled her eyes, her impatience palpable as she waited for a slip, but I pressed on, locked in on the purpose of this confrontation. I understand that Karen has expressed concerns regarding safety and potential disturbances, yet I believe true community spirit thrives through diversity, in our passions and expressions, in supporting one another. Passions? More like a public nuisance, Karen interjected, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. All you do is create noise and attract insects. You've encroached on our peace for too long. If you're allowed to keep that eyesore, what will stop others from turning this neighborhood into a junkyard? Her words ignited a fire inside me. But before I could respond, the tension in the room thickened. My neighbors began murmuring among themselves, inflating the weight of her unwarranted outburst. I could feel the moment shift, an invisible hand poised to tip the scales. Pausing to gather my thoughts, I remembered what my grandmother said. Resolve comes from within, not from the approval of others. Karen, I hear you, I said, deliberately meeting her fiery glare, refusing to back down. But you speak of peace as if it relies on suppressing others, as if you view community as conformity. Isn't it our differences that make us unique? Just look around this room. How many of us have let a passion drive our lives, whether it's gardening, cooking, or even your enthusiastic involvement with the HOA? Why should my passion for cars be any different? Low murmurs rippled through the audience, and I caught glimpses of hesitant nods, small victories blossoming here and there, gently lifting me. Karen's facade began to crack, and I seized the moment. I ask you all, do we want to live in a neighborhood governed by fear, where individuality is stifled by one voice? Or do we want to celebrate our differences, work together, and protect our shared home? In that fraction of time, as Karen's frown deepened and folks began murmuring anew, I felt a rush of clarity wash over me. I was not just fighting for that car, I was standing for every moment of joy it represented. I recalled how my grandmother expertly interwove tales of defiance through community gatherings, how she'd remind the neighborhood that it wasn't the rules that created a home, but the bonds shared between people. Let's remember, I continued, meeting the gazes of my neighbors. This isn't just about me or Karen. It's about all of us finding our place in this community. Imagine our children remembering summers filled with clinking tools and laughter. Isn't it worth fighting for? Isn't it worth welcoming each other's passions, no matter how unconventional they might appear? The atmosphere shifted again. The very air crackled with the intensity of confrontation and realization. I could see Karen struggle between holding onto her power and confronting the evident cracks in her argument. With every breath, I felt an overwhelming tide of support embracing me like a warm hug of collective resolve. The silence morphed into understanding, and the pendulum of power swayed uninvitedly toward my favor. The HOA board, seated at the far end, exchanged glances, and I could see uncertainty in their eyes as they weighed my words against Karen's high-handed claims. The dynamic was shifting. The tables turned, and the strength of a united community swelled against an overbearing authority figure. Then, just as Karen was poised to retort yet again, a neighbor whom I had barely spoken to stood up, his demeanor shifting the narrative. I remember when I painted my house a different color against the HOA's recommendations, he said, a grin breaking through the uncertain air. And while a handful of people were outraged, it became the talk of the block. Those little quirks brought us into each other's lives. With that encouragement, others chimed in, sharing their stories of passions and hobbies that once faced scrutiny. Karen's glower deepened, an unmistakable rage bubbling beneath her surface as she realized she had underestimated the collective power of community. The tension hung in the air like a taut string ready to snap. I could sense the tide was turning, and for once, it felt like the heavy weight of her unjustified criticism lifted from my shoulders. In this singular moment, I met her defiance with a determined smile. I was no longer the underdog. I was a voice in a cacophony of shared values. Together, we were loud. And as the echo of our shared defiance filled the room, it registered. A pivotal realization that would ripple through the authority wielded by Karen and the HOA. My heart raced, and I held my ground, knowing this was not merely about a car. It was about reclaiming space, dignity, and the threads that bound us all as neighbors. Finally, the moment came. One of the board members cleared her throat, steeling herself against institutional hesitation. Thank you for both points. We recognize the need for flexibility and understanding within our community. I felt the weight of their words settle like a promise. Karen's power was crumbling, the spark of unity igniting every spirit in that room. I could see it clearly now. My fight was more than just a restoration project. It was about carving out a corner of this neighborhood where passion and community thrived freely, without the chains of prejudice. As the dust settled from the chaotic HOA meeting, I found myself grappling with the whirlwind of emotions that had surged through me just moments before. I could hardly believe it. The board had sided with me. It was an unforeseen victory that ignited a spark not just within myself, but throughout the neighborhood. As I walked out of that fateful meeting, the air felt electric, like a summer storm ready to burst, charged with energy and transformation. Footsteps echoed behind me, a mix of hesitant neighbors and newfound supporters who had begun to gather, whispering among themselves, reflecting on the evening's events. A few of them approached me, their faces beaming with appreciation and understanding as they extended hands of fellowship. I never thought I could feel so inspired. One neighbor, a retiree named Jim, remarked with a shake of his head, "Not when it felt like the HOA was running this place like a prison." That sentiment lodged itself in my heart. Jim wasn't alone. Others shared their own encounters with the heavy-handed approach Karen had taken, dictating how they lived their lives, painting a tapestry of rebellion against an unjust authority. It seemed like I wasn't just fighting for my car restoration anymore. I had unknowingly sparked a sense of solidarity among others who had felt stifled under the categories of regulations laid down by an oppressive figure. But as their understanding washed over me, I felt the palpable weight of shame that had accompanied my struggles with Karen. The moments of isolation, the heartache of feeling misunderstood. Now, this journey had blossomed into something greater, a shared narrative of community resilience and individual expression. I turned to see my grandmother standing at the edge of the crowd, a proud smile illuminating her weathered face, serving as a living testament to the power of perseverance. "Grandma, we did it," I said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "I couldn't have done this without your encouragement." Her reassuring squeeze tightened around me, a silent promise that reinforced my belief that a small voice could echo throughout the landscape of conformity. In the following weeks, I poured my heart back into the classic car that had become my creative outlet, focusing not just on its restoration, but its symbolism, a symbol of freedom and personal expression. Meanwhile, Karen's influence had rapidly waned as words of her overreach spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Tap into the spirit of connection and camaraderie that we longed for, the neighborhood began to collaborate on projects, pooling efforts to improve our shared spaces rather than allowing a singular voice to dictate our lives. One evening, standing shoulder to shoulder with my neighbors, we launched a weekend street party, a celebration of our community's individuality and a memorialization of that meeting. Children ran laughing beneath strings of twinkling lights, while BBQs wafted the scent of grilled meats into the air. In the midst of this joyous display, I realized that communities transcend the barriers of regulations when individuals stand united. A powerful lesson emerged. When faced with injustice or entitlement, it isn't simply about fighting back. It's about forging bonds, creating pathways for dialogue, and celebrating the very essence of who we are as people. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a luminescent glow around us, I recognized the profound shift in the atmosphere. The neighborhood I once feared becoming alienated from had transformed into a place of belonging, a tapestry threaded with mutual respect and understanding. Emily, a single mother living down the street, approached me, smiles exchanged, as she disclosed plans for an art project she had been hesitant about formerly due to Karen's tight grip of control. The excitement in her voice was infectious, and in that instant, I felt the triumph of accountability resonate. Reflecting back on that tumultuous journey, my battles with Karen, my grandmother's tranquil wisdom, the unwavering support of neighbors, I realized what I truly gained through this conflict was not just a victory, but a decade of joy crafted into every restored vehicle. It wasn't merely about reclaiming my rights. It was about revitalizing a community's undying spirit. From that day forward, I became an ambassador for understanding and collaboration in our neighborhood, advocating for causes that celebrated freedom of expression. In this new era of relationship building, I had found my voice strengthened not solely for myself but for all of us. A united front against tyranny encapsulated in a single name: Karen. I walked forward with purpose, empowered and committed not just to my car restoration project, but to being an active participant in nurturing a community that would protect the joys of all its citizens.